Hello, today is December 8th, 1994, and my name is Dan Cruz, and I'm a volunteer with the Illinois State Historical Society, which is cooperating with a statewide effort to collect oral histories from Illinois citizens that participated in the events surrounding World War II. Today we are in the home of Herb Shaffner, who lives in Marshall, Illinois, and Herb served in the branch of the United States Armed Forces during World War II, and we are interviewing him about his experiences in that war. Herb, would you please start by introducing yourself to us and give us your full name and the place and date of your birth?
My full name is Herbert Shaffner. I have no middle initial. I was born in Martinsville, Illinois, May the 14th, 1923.
1923. Would you also give the name of your parents?
My dad's name was Samuel Tennis Shaffner, and my mother's name was Clara Spitler Shaffner.
And are there any details? Oh, I'm sorry. Do you have any brothers or sisters?
Yes, I came out of a family of 8, of which there were 6 boys and 2 girls. The 3 of the boys in the family, including myself, served in the armed service, and one of which I lost during World War II, who was in the Air Force, who was shot down over Albania in 1944.
And what are the names of your brothers and sisters?
Well, my oldest brother was named Gene, and the next brother's name was George, and the next name which I lost in the service overseas was named Wayne. And then my next brother was Frank, and then myself, and then was my sister Nell, and my brother Jack, and then my youngest sister Betty.
Are there any details about your parents or your family that you would like to give, such as your parents' occupation and maybe a little bit about the background of where you came from?
Well, my parents both came out of an agricultural background. My dad was a farmer, and my mother's folks were all farmers too, and they all my dad's family came from the Melrose area, and my mother's family were from Allwright, so they were both from this general area. And my dad and mother lived most of their life in the Melrose area after they were married until 1922, when they moved to Martinsville, and then the following year, 1923, I was born in Martinsville. I was the first child who was born in Martinsville. The older children were all born out in the country.
Well, after your parents moved to Martinsville, did they continue to farm a little?
My dad continued to farm. In fact, he farmed till, well, he didn't farm up till the time he had death, but he had livestock and he had some dairy cattle, and up to the time he died, he still had dairy cattle. But he quit farming in approximately 1947 or 8 in that area.
We're going to start moving up to the period in which you joined the military. But first I want to take you back a little bit of time right before that. And what was life like for you before the war, specifically during 1941?
Well, in 1941, I was a senior in high school. And
did you attend Martinsville High School?
I attended Martinsville High School, all 4 years I went to high school. And I very actively participated in sports, which was kind of the love of my life in those days. Of course, there weren't too many other outside activities that you could get involved in outside of sports in those days. So that was your main attraction. And of course, in the summer you played baseball if you had time. You know, of course, most of the people that came out of farm families, they had some type of job that their father had them doing during their spare time. You did have a lot of time. You did have a lot of time to play. So, but anyhow, in high school, I participated in most of the sports, and I wouldn't say I excelled at any of them, but I participated in all of them. Probably my best sport was football. I did better in it than anything else, you know. And of course, I think that part of that comes from the fact that all of my older brothers had participated in it, had been very above average athletes, you know, and of course that kind of spurs you on to want to do better if you're younger, when you want to emulate them, you know, and try to be as good as they are. So, but at that particular time, there weren't a lot of social activities for high school kids. I can remember of about the only thing, you had a jukebox, maybe in restaurants, or there used to be I was trying to remember the name of a establishment that was out east of town that they didn't serve any hard liquor. All they served was Cokes and things like that. And they had a dance floor, and it opened up about the time I was in the latter part of my junior senior year, that you could go out and but very few fellows could dance. You know, so the girls could, but the fellows could. So it wasn't. I didn't learn how to dance till I later moved away from Martinsville. So that didn't help a lot as far as I was concerned. But there weren't too many social activities going on at that particular time.
Now, did you graduate in the spring of 1941?
I graduated in May 1941.
Okay, and from 1941 to let's say December of 1941, what were you involved with?
Well, immediately after graduation, there was 3 of us decided that we were going to the city and make our fortune. So Bill Downey, Conrad Zimmerman, and myself all had made a decision. They had primarily made a decision that allowed me to go with them, decided we were going to go to Detroit and make some money, some easy money, because there wasn't any jobs around in the farming community out in those days that paid any money anyhow. So right after graduation, we piled in an old, seemed like to me it was a 36 Pontiac that Conrad Zimmerman had. It had a rumble seat in it, and one of us would ride in the rumble seat and the other would ride up in front, and we took off and started out for Detroit. And needless to say, things weren't quite as easy when we got there as we thought they were going to be, and jobs were very difficult. I can remember going out to the Ford plant at River Rouge, Michigan, and lines would be a mile long out there, and they might say, well, there's no jobs today, or they might say, well, there's 10 positions being filled. So you'd go out there and stand and never even get close to, to where anybody would ever interview you. So this, and the other 2 boys were still having the same problem I was, of trying to find a job. So finally, after staying there about a month and almost starving from not having not much money or just enough to eat, I'd find a job where I'd wash dishes or sweep I remember I had a job sweeping a mill, big grain mill, sweeping floors in there at night after everything was closed. That was the most lonesome job I ever had in my life. I detested it more than anything I'd ever done, between that and washing dishes. So after about a month of that, I'd almost given up, and my dad had almost forbid me to go when I left anyhow. I didn't want to go back as a failure, and have him to say, well, he was right. So after about a month or 6 weeks, I run across 2 young men who were that used to come and visit in the same neighborhood where I lived in, and that hung out at some of the places where we did. And they asked what I was doing, and I said I wasn't doing anything. I didn't have a job. And I said, what are you fellows doing? And he said, well, we're working for the telephone company. And I said, well, how did you get your job? And one boy said, well, my brother lives next door to the president of the telephone company out on a lake. There's a lot of lakes around Detroit, suburban area. And he said, he got us a job. And he said, well, I'll ask him if you'd like to have a job, I'll see if he can get you one. I said, great. So anyhow, he asked his brother to intercede, and I got a job with the telephone company by going down and being interviewed, and got a job that way. So I worked for them starting in about I think maybe it may have been July in that area in 1941. And then I worked for them till the time you're asking me to come up to, which would be December from the later fall of 41. I was working for the Michigan Bell Telephone Company in suburban Detroit.
Well, what thoughts did you have about the war before the United States became directly involved in the conflict?
I don't remember of having, as a young person, that wasn't, we studied about World War I, all the effects of the before we got into it from history and in school and everybody. It wasn't anything that ever seemed very close to you. It was kind of a remote event that was happening a long ways away, you know, which didn't really affect us that much. So until we were invaded at Pearl Harbor, I'd never really given it much thought. I don't think most young people really thought that much about it before that, you know.
Well, did you hear the December 7th, 1941 radio announcement about the bombing of Pearl Harbor? Where were you and what were you doing at that time, and what was your reaction and the reaction of those around you?
Well, I was in Royal Oak, Michigan at the time, and I happened to be out on Sunday afternoon. I don't know, I was up at the drugstore somewhere, and I came home, and my landlady said to me, "Did you hear the news?" And I said, "No, what are you talking about?" She said, "They just announced over the radio that the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor." And that was the first news I'd had of it, you know. And I can't remember exactly what my thoughts were. That's been a long time ago. Like I say, when we're younger, we don't have some of the thoughts I presume that we would now, you know, if the same thing happened, you know. I know I was anxious at what that might bring and things of that nature, you know. And in fact, the very next day, two of my friends that worked for the telephone company decided they were going to go down and join the Marines. And they had asked me to go along with them. And I thought a long time about it before I decided I didn't want to go to the Marines. I thought that wasn't the one place that I wanted to go. If I was going to go, I wanted to go someplace other than the Marines. Not that there was anything wrong with it, but it just wasn't my bag at that particular time. You know.
Well, had you formed any prior opinions or developed any feeling about what was taking place in Europe or Asia at this time?
No, I can't remember of having very many thoughts about that. No, I don't. I can't really say that I did. No.
Okay. Do you recall reading newspaper accounts of German aggression in Europe? Or?
Oh, sure. Yeah. Uh-huh. There were. It wasn't. You know. When I was home, we didn't. Until later years, my dad didn't even subscribe to newspapers. You know, and I did some of the things that we have, which are considered necessities now. If you didn't feel that you could afford them and just absolutely had to have them, you didn't have them in those days. You know, so we lived in a different. It's hard for people sometimes to comprehend. You know, back in days, and even prior to my days, there were things that people. That they had a lot less than we had, you know, so it's all relative, you know. But anyhow, we didn't have such simple things as aspirins, you know, right. Which we just consider an everyday thing.
Well, what events led to your entry into military service? Were you already in the service, drafted, or did you volunteer?
Well, excuse me. I tried to get into the Naval Air Force, and I went and did my preliminary work, and the last thing they did was I was okay, would be accepted. I took my physical exam, and during my high school football days, I'd had an injury to my nose, and it had parts of I had a deviated septum, and it had made my nasal passages partially blocked on one side. One of the passages was. So when the doctor did my physical, he said, everything's fine except one thing, and I can't pass you for that. He said, your nose I can't accept you for that because you wouldn't be able to breathe oxygen through your nose if you have to put an oxygen mask on. And he says, that's one requisite we have. And he said, now, if you want to go have it operated on, he said, we'll go ahead and pass you, and you can go ahead into the Naval Air Cadet program. He said, I can't pass you until that happens. And I said, well, what is my option? And he said, well, you can go have it operated on. And I said, well, how much would you think that would cost? And he said, well, probably maybe $150. I said, well, I'm sorry, I don't have that kind of money. I have to cancel this out, you know. So that let that program go. So then I just hung around and was later drafted.
When were you drafted? Remember?
I'll have to consult here. I'm not too sure. It was in March of 1943. Okay. Probably the latter part of March of 1943. I was living in Detroit. Wasn't living. When I was living, I was registered for the service when I lived in Detroit. Mm-hmm. And when I left, and I worked in Detroit a year, and I came back after in 1941. In 1942, about in December of 42. And I worked here for it was then the Ohio Oil Company, which would now be Marathon. I worked for them a year before I went to service. But I was still registered in Detroit, so when my call to go to be examined, I had to go back to Detroit in order to be inducted into the service. So I was inducted in the service in Detroit in 1943, and it was in March, if I remember certainly right.
Do you have any special memories of the day in which you were inducted and what took place?
Yeah, I remember we were, of course, those things are a little hazy sometimes. All I remember, there was an enormous bunch of us, like in an armory, a place of that particular nature, which we were all taken and sworn in, you know, and then after the swearing in, we're all put on buses and sent to a area where we were processed, you know, which was, for me, was Fort Custer, which was outside Detroit. Went up there and we're all processed where you start getting your shots, you get your uniform and everything. You don't really do anything, but from there, then after you get processed, then they send you to a basic training center, which is the next step in what to do in the service.
How old were you at the time you were inducted and went to the training center?
I would have been 19. Yeah.
And you mentioned you were sent to Fort Custer, and then you went on to basic training. Where did you take your basic training at?
Took a basic training of all places at Atlantic City, New Jersey.
Is that right? Now, was this in the United States Army infantry?
This was an we were assigned to the United States Air Force without any particular job description. You don't have any yet until they give you some kind of training. You're just all Air Force trainees. That's what you were. So we were sent there along with all of them.
Well, tell me a little bit about what kind of things you did during your basic training.
Well, basic training involves getting yourself physically fit, mentally fit, in order to fight more than anything else. And it's basically all it's discipline more than anything else, because although we may think we have it most of the time, Army discipline is completely different than any other kind, and there isn't any deviation from it. You know, most other disciplines you can deviate a little bit from it, use your own judgment, but service discipline is different. So that's the biggest thing, I think, to get you physically fit and mentally fit to start the Army program and know that you're going to have to fight, you know.
Well, tell me about any other training camps that you attended, and if you have any special memories that occurred there.
Well, after about 6 weeks of basic training in Atlantic City, which most of it's physical training with some mental training along with it too. I was sent to a camp in Missouri, Neosho, Missouri, called Camp Crowder, which I received training in the telephone field, which I had previously worked in before I went to service first with the Bell Telephone Company. So I had extensive training again, and along with what I'd already had in more telephone central office work and things of that nature for telephone service again.
Do you remember anything special that happened there? Any interesting stories or just things that stand out in your mind?
I remember it was Neosho was and still is a small town, probably maybe 10 or 15,000 people, and Camp Crowder was a huge military base. Probably at the time I was there, maybe in the neighborhood of 100,000 troops. And so Neosho was the closest town, and it was just a few miles away. I'd say maybe 5, 6, 7, 8 miles away. And then the other towns that were close, the only town that of any size was close was Joplin. And Joplin was about, that time was about 40,000, maybe 45. And all I can remember when you went into town, that there was wall-to-wall soldiers. That's all there was to it. And so when you went, there wasn't much reason to go to town because you didn't see any of the soldiers. So
The odds of meeting a young lady were against you.
yeah, yeah. Well, yeah, you didn't see too many. They were all off the street.
Their parents probably took them off the street.
Took them off the street, right.
Did you receive any leaves or passes when you were doing your training?
Yes, I took one 3-day pass when I was at Camp Crowder, but I didn't have any leaves there. But I did have a long weekend pass, a 3-day pass, which I came home on when I was down there, and it's about probably 400 miles from Martinsville, so it wasn't that bad. You could make it. You weren't supposed to go that far, but as long as the MPs didn't catch you and you were late and you were that far away, you were all right. If you had time to get back, well, they usually wouldn't pay attention to you. You weren't supposed to only be a certain distance when you had a 3-day pass, and some were like 200 or 300 miles.
What do you recall of this period while you were going to your training? Anything that stands out about, I know you said it's wall-to-wall soldiers, but talk to me a little bit about maybe the friends that you made or your association with any civilians.
Well, you don't really have any, I can't remember having any association with civilians. That's something that you didn't really see that much of, because you really didn't have that much in common once you become, there's a certain camaraderie that you had with the people that you were with, but it didn't encompass civilians outside of your own people that you knew. See, I mean, it just wasn't, and the civilian didn't really have anything in common with you that much. There were civilians who did things for military personnel, and I was never one which that happened to, but there were lots of them that were taken in and fed and things of that nature on weekends and things as to be entertained and what have you, but that was something that never happened to me, but I know it did happen to a lot of people. But you meet a lot of, every station you're at, you meet different friends, and usually you'll have 2 or 3 people that are fairly close friends, and you'll have a lot of acquaintances you remember too, but almost every walk or almost every station you're at, you'll have somebody that you become close friends with, and so but then that ceases, you kind of lose track of them after you go to the next station because it's time to move on and do something else.
Well, once you completed your training, what was your military unit?
Well, while I was at Crowder, I decided I'd always had my urge to want to fly, so I decided to try to get into the Army Air Force. So I go through the same procedure almost like I did when I tried to get in the Navy, so I go through all the rigmarole and take my physical, and I have the same thing put to me that my nose is bad and I'll have to have it operated on before I can get into the cadet program. So I said, well, will you do it in the service? And they said, sure, we'll do it. And so I had my nose operated on, and after it was done, they passed me, so I went into the cadet program. I was in the signal, part of the signal division attached to the Air Force before that. Then after this happened, then I went directly to the cadet program in the Air Force. And at the time that I got in, they were not really wanting very many pilots anymore. This was starting to get where they'd had a lot of them trained, and there was an influx almost of pilots. So they were beginning to get very, very picky. So they found a lot of ways to separate and get down to maybe the 5 or 10% they wanted out of, say if they had 100, like you say, they'd want 10 or 5 or 10 of them. So most of them within the first few weeks were what we call washed out. They separated them out of there. And then after that happened to you, then you had to do something associated with flying. In other words, you had to be a crewman of some type on flying duty. Some of us asked the other thing, they said, no, you can't do that, you have to be on flying status. So from there I was transferred to an air base where I was going to be trained as a mechanic and a gunner. And in the meantime, they decided they didn't need any mechanics and gunners anymore, so they closed the school. So here I am, I'm sitting out in this particular school with really nothing to do. So a lot of the young kids who were with me then I had what they call an MOS, which was a description of my job at that particular time, because I'd gotten it from the Signal Corps. So at least I had an MOS, but the people that didn't have one, the new trainees that came in, were immediately sent to the infantry because they were needing men in Europe at that particular time in the infantry, training them to be foot soldiers. So I was most fortunate that I had an Air Force connected MOS that I still stayed in the Air Force.
And that was communications or
yes,
telephone?
Right.
What were your assigned duties once you went to your military unit?
Well, the first the military. You mean the one overseas with?
Yeah.
I was assigned to a unit in San Antonio, Texas, which was what we call staging to go overseas in the Pacific. And we were a support group called an air depot group for B-29s. So in the spring of 1944, I went to San Antonio, Texas, where this outfit was forming. And they brought in men from everywhere, of every kind of description that would have something to do with complete maintenance on B-29s. And our outfit was what we call a signal company outfit, and we had charge of communications. We had cryptographers, we had radio operators, we had radio repairmen. We had people of almost all descriptions that had anything to do with communications in the Air Force. So we were formed as that kind of group and went overseas that way.
There were no, I'm kind of answering the question myself, but were there any transfers to other units or anything like this?
Well, I'd been in two. Well, after the cadet program, I went to a air base in Lincoln, Nebraska, where I was supposed to go to mechanic school. It closed. So we were there through the winter, and then later on in the winter, I was sent to a place called Sedalia, Missouri, which is outside of Kansas City, a little ways, which was called a Troop Carrier Command base. And all they did there was train pilots how to pull and tow gliders. Excuse me. They used C-46s and C-47s, and the pilots were trained how to take off with a glider and tow them, and it's a little bit different than just flying an airplane by itself. So the base was...
The same type of craft that were used during the invasion of Europe.
Yes, that's what they were doing, yeah. But anyhow, I was there for maybe 3 or 4 months, and then I got orders to go to the outfit in San Antonio, which was forming overseas air depot.
Did you know that you'd be going towards Asia, or did you have any idea?
You were never told at any time where you were going to go. You just knew that if you went to the West Coast, that you're not going to go to Europe.
Yeah. Did you have a feeling? Did you have a desire whether to go to Europe or Asia? Or did you care?
No, at that time, it doesn't really. There's not a. I think most of everybody would, if they would have had their rathers, they would have probably rather gone to Europe, because Europe is something we knew a little bit about. We didn't know anything about the Pacific theater, and most all the Pacific theater was fought over small islands, and either that or, of course, most of the fighting and the early fighting was done in New Guinea, but and that was probably the worst theater of all. The small islands were all right. I mean, they were not jungles, so to speak, like New Guinea and those areas, in that area where they fought, and then the Indo-China theater, there was a lot of bad terrain they fought in.
Well, when were you sent overseas? Where did you go, and how did you get there?
Well, we left. We left we were staged at Oklahoma City at Tinker Air Force Base. That was the last base that we were at before we went overseas, the final staging area, where everybody was put together and formed, and the unit was going to go overseas with us. And then we moved from there by train to Seattle, Washington. And we stayed there a few days, maybe a week or 10 days, somewhere in that area, before we were put on board a ship and to start our trip overseas. Nobody knew where we were going. All we knew, we were going somewhere in the Pacific. And we were put on in a converted Liberty ship that had they'd taken the holes that kept the cargo in, and they put up bunks like the Navy used bunks that were, they just go in a tier of maybe 4 or 5 up, and then there was a tier right next to them going 4 or 5 up, and then there'd be an aisleway you get through, and then there was another bunch. So you're kind of put in there, kind of stacked in there. But anyhow, they had temporary hammocks put in these Liberty ships, and we went overseas in that Liberty ship. Well, it was pretty. There was a lot of people on it with no place to go. In other words, if you could find a place to get out on deck and sit down, you were pretty lucky. And you couldn't everybody be out on deck at the same time anyhow. There wasn't enough room out there. Some of them had to be down in the deck. And of course, some of them didn't wish to come up, especially after they got seasick.
How was the trip over? Was it a rough trip, and how long did it take?
Well, the basic time we were on the ship was about 30 days. Because we left in the midst of a big storm. After we left, we got out of Puget Sound. This old ship, it almost did everything but turn you loose, And we had hit a terrible storm, and the sea was real rough for about the first, almost till we got to Hawaii. We stopped at Pearl Harbor for a couple, 3 days, because from then on we were going to be in a convoy. We went by ourselves to Pearl Harbor. And then we met and formed in a convoy, and once we left Pearl Harbor, we were in a Navy convoy, you know, with a lot of other ships.
Well, let me interrupt you before we talk, and we'll pick up with the convoy in just a minute. At Pearl Harbor, please tell me what it was like going to Pearl Harbor. Did you still, or could you see damage that had been left by the Japanese at that time?
Well, we were anchors far enough away that there wasn't much you could see. And by that time, see, this would have been 1945. There was, most everything was cleaned up and it was back to normal. It was back to normal operation, had been for years even up to then, see, so.
Now, what was the date in which you left the United States heading out overseas?
Well, I can't tell you the exact date, but it would have been in February, or late February, early March of 1945.
Okay. Well, let's go back now to the convoy, and your convoy is forming out in the off the coast of Pearl Harbor. And what happened then?
Well, there was about 15 or 20 ships, and I mean there were transport cargo ships and what have you. And we had 3 or 4 naval escort. They were small destroyers, escort destroyers that one would be out on one side, one outside, one in front and one in the back. And they were the submarine hunters, you know, they try to. We had 2 or 3 submarine alerts while we were going over there, but we were never attacked at least to our knowledge anyhow. Sometimes we'd have an alert and all of a sudden we'd see the attack destroyer turn and take off some direction, and almost no time at all they'd be gone, you know, and maybe we'd not see it maybe the rest of the day, and maybe that next morning we'd see it back in the convoy. You never know where it was at. They were out, say if they were chasing submarines, but we were never attacked. So there weren't very many Japanese submarines anyhow. So at that time of the war, they never had a very big navy anyhow, as far as submarine service was concerned. So it was never a big problem like it was in the North Atlantic, where it probably sank at one time as much as a fourth of our shipping, you know, overseas.
Where did you go when you went on your convoy, and what happened once you arrived there?
Well, we left Pearl Harbor, and we stopped at 2 places, and I can't tell you which was first. We stopped, seemed like to me, Anahuac Atoll was one that we stopped at. And I don't know what the reason was behind the stopping, unless it was to get certain supplies and fuel and what have you, I don't know. But anyhow, we stopped at Anahuac Atoll, and then we stopped at the Marshall Islands, and also on the way. And that each one of those places we'd stay 2 or 3 days, you know, and then we'd move on or whatever. And that's the reason why it took so long. It's not a 30-day trip over there. In fact, when I came back home, I came back on a naval ship, a troop ship, so to speak, and it was about 14 or 15 days coming back over there. So it's a lot different than what was going over when we came back, because we didn't stop anywhere. It was a complete straight line for San Francisco, and that was it.
So after you left the Marshall Islands, where did they take you?
We landed, and our next stop was Guam. We anchored in the harbor. The whole convoy went to Guam. We went into a secured harbor, which had an entrance which was mined and everything. That kept it patrolled, you know, so didn't any submarines slip inside the harbor. But then we anchored, and then was taken off on landing crafts to the beach area.
Well, once you arrived, what were you assigned to do?
Well, basically, the first thing we were assigned to do, like I said, we were an air depot group, which was a maintenance facility for B-29s. And ours, like I said, we were only the the Signal Corps branch of it. The people that did all the other work was also in our, what we call the group, the mechanics, the radar man, all those people were all included, but they were in different outfits. But we were a new group. There was also one group in there were ahead of us. There was an air depot group in there ahead of us. So when we came, there wasn't any place for us really to, we didn't have any places for our supplies. We didn't have any places to live. And basically, we didn't have any places for our supply areas, our supply buildings. So the first thing that we did is they divided us up in 10-man crews, and we started putting up the foundations for buildings to be put up, for Air Force supply units. So that was the first thing we did. At that time, we were living out in our pup tents on the ground at that particular time.
Where you were assigned, what was there a name to this base, or was it?
It was called Harmon Field.
Harmon Field.
Yes.
What was your thoughts about the nation's war efforts up to this time? You've probably seen quite a bit of training in the States, and of course you're hearing about reports of successes.
The basic type of films that you would see what little you got to see in those days. You could read Stars and Stripes, although that wasn't always easy, and you could see a newsreel sometimes at the movie. But that was about the extent of what, and of course you had radio news. That was the extent of what you could listen to that was going on in the world. So you were kind of isolated in that area. You didn't have a lot of thoughts. So I can't answer that very well.
If you did not immediately enter a combat zone, where did you go before entering a combat zone? Was it Guam, would you say?
Well, Guam was not. It was a secured area. It was not a combat zone.
Okay.
That had already been secured. We had parts of the island that there were still Japanese troops on, but that was just isolated, and you didn't go over there. So they patrolled that area to make sure they were no problem. They just cut them off and isolated them. See, that's what was done in the Pacific all the time. Just isolated complete island, just leave them there. So they didn't have any supplies. They wouldn't bother anybody.
Well, I understand that sometimes the method in which the United States Army or the military used in the Pacific was the island hopping.
Mm-hmm.
They would sometimes
Exactly.
Hop over one island and just to secure other ones and
Exactly.
establish a beachhead or a base on those islands. I understand that.
The reason the way we wanted Iwo Jima so bad, so Iwo Jima was just about halfway between the Mariana Islands, which Guam was one of them, Tinian and Saipan were the other two. That was halfway between us and Japan. So once they got Saipan, we could establish fighter bases there, which we could have fighter escorts going into Japan. The way it was, we couldn't have any when they were all flying out of the Marianas. It's too far. Couldn't get a fighter up there and back, even with wing tanks and all.
Well, what did you enter any combat zones while you were over in the Pacific?
No, that's the farthest I got.
And tell me about maybe some of the missions in which the crews or the planes in which your crew worked with. What kind of missions were they assigned to do in the B-29?
Well, I basically, after I was over there, in the meantime, I got out of what I was doing and trained to be a watchmaker while I was overseas. And that time I was working on crews watches, and crews clocks and airplane clocks and what have you. So that's basic. But we were attached to the instrument section, which included the bomb sight division, with all the instruments, the bomb sight division.
Was this the Norden bomb site that they were using at this time? Or was
Yes.
that, okay.
Then we also was in what we call central fire control, which was the B-29 had one primary gunner. The later ones did. He sat in a bubble back about 2/3 the way back on the airplane, or halfway back, and he controlled all the guns from by radar from his one position. And that was called Central Fire Control. That was also in our building. But we were not allowed, if you were in the bomb site division, you could come in our division. We couldn't go in there. We were even restricted from going into the bomb site. It was that secret and they wouldn't allow you in. Central Fire Control, you could go in it, but it was basically radar. But we were all together in that one unit.
So the planes in which you were preparing, what kind of missions were they going on?
Well, they would be regular aircraft. See, all the base where I was at was not didn't operate the bombers out of there. We only wing that we had there was that went up and took pictures. That's all this wing that was attached to this base was. All the crews that were running bomb runs were stationed at two other fields that were just a little ways away from them. It was called North and Northwest Field. And all those crews worked out of there. We didn't have any bombers making runs off of our base, because it was basically for that one photo recon unit, and also all the transport planes from everywhere used the base that we were on. All the Air Transport Command that flew all of the wounded, all the supplies and everything, they used our base. That was what their base was.
Can you give me an idea of the size of this base? How many planes were there? Any idea? Were there dozens?
Well,
or more?
No, we didn't have very. Like I say, we were the only operational unit we had was the photo reconnaissance unit.
And what kind of planes did they use for that?
They used 29s.
Oh, did
just like
they
they
did?
used anything. And they would follow the bombers up, and they would take photographs to see how much damage was done. That's where you found out how much good you were doing with your bombers. But all the operational aircraft, all the operational bombers flew out of the other two fields, North and Northwest Field.
Now, how far were they from you, these other fields?
Well, the island was only about 45 miles long, so we were at the north end of it, and they probably were 5, 6, 7 miles away in that area, somewhere maybe 10 at most.
We're changing gears just a little bit. Let me check my tape here to see how much more we have. I think we're getting close to the end of one side, which we are. Herb, I'm going to fast forward this, and then we're going to pick up on the other side. Okay, we're going to pick back up, and I'm going to change gears for a little bit, and I'm going to ask you about letters from home. Did you receive many letters while you were over in Guam?
Oh, sure. My wife was very loyal. There was hardly a day that I didn't get a letter from home. Now, you might not get one every day because that's the way things were. You might go 2 or 3 or 4 days, and then you get 3 or 4 at one time, although they were mailed every day.
Right.
That's but our mail service was extremely good, I thought. Usually it was about, as a general rule, it was about 4 days or so in that range, 4 or 5 days from the time Violet would write till I'd have the letter.
Well, did you ever receive any packages, and how often, and what kind of things did you get in the little packages?
Well, usually everybody sent food. That's the one thing that a soldier always wanted, and it seemed like the big thing that everybody wanted to send was fruitcakes, because that was
traveled the best.
They traveled the best. So, yes, I got several food packages. I was never neglected by my family or my wife, so I was very fortunate. I always had plenty of letters and a lot of packages.
Did most of the other men you served with today write and receive letters from home?
Yes, I think everybody. I think that's your lifeblood when you're away from home. If you don't hear from home, why? I think the single guys didn't get nearly as many letters as the people who were married.
Now, when were you married?
I was married in 1944. 44.
Um,
March 11, 44.
Did you forge close bonds of friendship with many or some of the men you served with?
Yes, I still remain friends with several of them. And
Well, that was my next question,
Yeah.
is have you remained in contact with any of your World War II companions?
Yes, we have a reunion every 18 months of the people that served with our unit overseas, and we have a pretty good representation.
While you were stationed over in Guam, did you ever have the opportunity to see or talk or have experiences where you saw maybe Japanese prisoners of war?
We had a few that at one time or two or three times I've seen it that worked doing menial jobs for the Army when we were over there, but that wasn't a big thing. No.
Could you maybe describe their demeanor at this time, or maybe, if not directly, seeing these, but maybe stories have heard of how these Japanese prisoners were acting? The traditional thing we always hear in the movies about the Japanese losing face and committing suicide, but the attitude of these prisoners in which.
Well, I can say we weren't around them that much, and I wasn't intimately involved anywhere where you could get very much of an opinion. If you just walked by and seen one, there's hardly any way you're going to get any opinion from them. But that's about the extent of what the contact that I had with what few the contact that I did have with it was very limited. I had contact with the only contact I had with German prisoners of war is we had some of them that worked serving us food when we came back from overseas. That were still prisoners of war. And they brought some German prisoners to the United States. I don't know whether they ever brought any Japanese, but some German prisoners of war were brought to the United States and served some time over here. But I don't know that. I doubt that any Japanese were. I think they were all interned in their own area.
Well, tell me this, Herb. Tell us what you and the other men you served with, what did you guys do to celebrate, like, say, traditional holidays such as Thanksgiving and Christmas?
Well, there wasn't, outside of our units trying to maybe serve us better food and more traditional food at that particular time, and of course there were always the traditional, if you chose to go, there were always traditional religious ceremonies involved, that the service always had.
Did you attend church often or regular while you were in the service?
No, I didn't attend regularly. Once in a while, you get to have a service where everybody was involved in, But that, I don't know, there were so many other things you were doing, that, and so many times that you worked on Sunday just like you did any other day, And unless you're really, really committed and wanted to find some time to do it, you'd almost have to find a time to do any religious celebrating that you wanted to do, But when I was overseas, most of the time I was over there, we worked 7 days a week just like that, which was good because there wasn't any need to have spare time. You didn't have anything to do with it, Only to worry and think about something maybe which was, if you were working, you had your mind and body occupied,
Well, when and how did you return to the United States after the war?
Well, in February of 1946, we left from Guam and went to Saipan in an LST. A group of us who were going to be separated. We were all separated by what we call points. In those days, they took the length of time you were in the service, the length of time you spent overseas, and you got so many points for each month in the service, so many times for each month you overseas, so many points for battle campaigns you're in, this, that, and the other. And then you got points for those, and after you got so many points, you were in a category, and that bunch went home. You know, and they started out with the people that had the most points and separated you from going down. In other words, if you had 150 or more points, or whatever it was, you would be the first one to go home, and then the next bunch would be 140, so to speak. So the way it was handled, you know. So there were some that left as early as November and December of '45 to go home, you know. But I didn't have as many points because just had 3 years in the service and only a year overseas, so that didn't give you a lot of points like some people who had been in the service 4 years or more and maybe spent 2 years overseas and had a lot of battle stars, and first thing you know, they'd have 150, 60, 70 points, you know, so they would be the first ones, which is the way it should have been.
And so you say you were coming back in
February of 46 rather. We left from Guam and went to Saipan, and there we were processed to where we were going to go, and I was to be separated at Jefferson Barracks, Missouri, St. Louis, Missouri. So we were then put on a Navy troop ship that was made just to transport troops with, and for a journey which seemed like to be either 14 or 15 days, and our destination was San Francisco. And we docked in San Francisco and got off of the boat and went across the warehouse wharf into the other side into another river boat and went up the river to Camp Stoneman, which is about 40 miles from San Francisco, where we were processed to go to and put in troop trains to go to our separation bases.
Mm-hmm.
We were there maybe 2 or 3 days in the separation base, which was St. Louis, Jefferson Barracks.
Well, tell me about your military rank at this time and any decorations, campaign decorations, or
well, I was a sergeant. I can't tell you about the campaign. I did have some information here on it, but
I believe it is on your discharge.
Yeah, is it on here? I knew it was on that other, but what you're entitled to have. Yeah, here it is. Victory ribbon. These are the decorations that I was awarded. These are the ones listed: Victory ribbon, American Theater ribbon, Asiatic Pacific Theater ribbon, and Good Conduct medal. Those are the awards which I was.
Were there any campaigns which, when you were in Guam, were there any campaigns in which you were associated with?
Well, you couldn't really call yourself being in a campaign unless the island or the area was not secured.
Okay.
So that's the only way that you got decorations, so to speak, you know. And if it was a so to speak safe area, you didn't get a campaign ribbon, or it was the way it should be. You know, it's not much. You're serving overseas, but you were not in any real immediate danger. You know, well, you could have possibly. We had some air raid alerts, but we never did have any time that we had an air raid. You know, I think they might have been false alarms. You know, but anyhow, so that would have been the closest thing that we would have had to any type of action. But that's the basic ones I was awarded.
Well, how did you get along with the men with whom you had the greatest contact?
I don't ever remember having any real problems with anybody. I think most of the people in the Air Force were not very cognizant of rank. I mean, everybody had rank, and it was not always a symbol of authority. And most branches of the service, rank was a symbol of authority, you know, but in our branch, it was just a symbol of somebody having a little more, was able to do a job a little bit better. In other words, if you were real good as a mechanic, you could be a master sergeant, although that doesn't mean that you would be that great at handling men, you know, but at least you were good at what your job was, you know.
Mm-hmm.
So rank in the Air Force was a little bit different designation, although there were some who were put in position to command, you know, but it was not quite the same way it seemed to me like it was in other branches of the service, because they were not so in tune to that particular thing of thinking about rank only, you know, and it was not thought of in our branch that much. If you didn't stand in awe of somebody who was of a lot higher rank than you were.
With 50 years hindsight, now we're sitting here in 1994, were there things that you would do differently if you could do them once again, when you look back at your military career?
Well, I was thankful in a way. I wanted to fly, and I was thankful after it was all over with. I'd been with the Air Force all that time, and I've seen so many bad things happen that I think I was thankful after it was over with that I did not succeed in doing what I wanted to do.
Would you mind sharing one of those bad things you saw? I think that
Well, military aircraft are not very safe, as everyone knows, as a general rule, especially in those days. And we had a lot of crashes when I was overseas and around our area, you know, because and every one of those you see and kind of makes you a little more thankful that you're not doing that, you know, and see people get killed, you know, that we're not even in combat, you know. So that probably was the one thing that I wanted to do so badly that I was thankful for afterwards that I didn't, you know. And I did some flying after I got out of the service, and I found out it wasn't quite as great as I thought it was going to be. You know?
So you got your pilot's license?
I did after I got out of the service, yes.
Give me your opinion of the B-29. You've spent a little time on that plane, working on it, and some of the mechanics.
Well, it was the super bomber of its time. It superseded the 17 because it had a lot longer range and could carry a lot heavier load than a B-17 could. It was a real good aircraft. As I say, it was made for that theater over there because they had to fly awfully long missions and spending 14 hours in the air in that range is a long time to spend in the air. And those other aircraft at that time didn't have that kind of range to get up to go to Japan and back, and that's as close as we were going to get until they. I don't even know whether the Philippines would have been any closer to Japan. I don't think it was any closer. I think the Marianas was as close as you could get. And still have. They needed a lot of. They needed an area where they could get about 12,000 foot runways. You know, 10 to 12,000 foot runways. Well, some of those islands weren't even big enough that we were fighting over. Weren't even big enough. Runway that length would more than cover the go from one side to the other. You know.
Right.
So they had. There was only certain. The Marianas was one area which they thought the location was good. I mean, as far as being able to get there and back, and also have places where they could put the kind of air bases in they needed. And we had 5 air bases in those islands. We had 2 of them on Guam, there were 2 of them on Saipan, 2 different fields, and there was 1 on Tinian. Just 1 air base on Tinian. It was the smallest island.
What did you think of the island of Guam? Was it pretty? Describe your.
It was outside of the fact that it didn't have real, you think of islands having great beaches. The climate was good, but the beaches were, they were rocky. I mean, there were a lot of coral rock. And of course, these islands are built up with a lot of coral rock in here. And if you'd go down to the beach, you'd have to wear shoes or thongs all the time. You just cut your feet all up, And there was some sand there, but it wasn't. You think of a tropical island as being a nice sandy beach. That's what your ideas are. But that's not true. But basically, the climate was good. We would be in most of the time, we had a season about like you would have here, summer, winter, spring, fall, and summer season. And of course, the summer season was the hottest of all. And it'd run up in the 90s pretty well at that time. And then in the fall, it'd start cooling. The winter, you'd notice the biggest difference at night. It'd be cooler at night. And not real cool, but I mean, it'd get cool enough that you'd want a blanket on, at night. But outside of that, and there are certain times a year it would rain more than it would others. And you'd look up and then you'd see a little cloud come by. It looked like it was about yay big. It just would cover up the sun, and it would just literally come down in torrents out of that little cloud.
Is that right?
Then it was gone, the sun would be out so after it went by. Just, it had some unusual weather, but it was good weather. The only thing was so much humidity that you had trouble trying to keep everything from molding on it. That was the biggest problem. And to keep it dried out, keep it in the sun, get it out in the sun every day. If you did every few days, you'd have bed clothes, whatever, don't be mildew, smell like mildew.
What was the most difficult thing you had to do during your period of military service?
I must presume stay away from home probably was the most difficult thing. It was the hardest to be without. Excuse me, hardest to be without being around the people you love, and being away from them, for long periods of time.
Well, is there any one thing that stands out as your most successful achievement in your military service?
I don't know of anything that was what we call outstanding. I don't think too many people have that unless they were involved in some function which was unusual, or such as fighting, some type of fighting unit that they did special things. Or I was not involved in anything of that nature.
Well, how did you learn about VJ Day, and what was your reaction to that?
Well, of course, we learned through just through the announcement from Armed Services Radio, And oh, guys, that was a great celebration. That was the best news that you could have heard for anybody. Yeah, that was a great day. We didn't do much that day. We did a lot of celebrating.
Did you?
Yes.
What was your opinion of the use of the atomic bomb when it was used on Japan in 1945?
Well,
and that plane left from Tinian, so that's one of the areas in which you were stationed.
Yes, the bomb was left it was delivered to Guam, and then it was taken from there over to Tinian, where the wing that flew the bomb up there was based on Tinian. I think they wanted to keep it as, we knew there was something going on.
Why is that? Yeah, I'm kind of curious to hear about this.
In the service, there were always rumors. There was always somebody had a rumor started, and they could be involved in everything. But you heard a rumor about something completely different happening, and nobody seemed to know what it was, but they knew there was something going on. And then when they dropped all this stuff off, it was hush hush. It was brought over on a cruiser on the Indianapolis, my bombs were. And when they were all dropped off at Guam, the people who were involved, of course, knew that there was something really special going on. Well, this you keep certain things secret, but you can't keep it completely subdued because they're going to tell somebody. You know, especially they weren't sure what it was, but we knew there was something unusual going on, but we didn't know what would happen. And then they did some things which you don't normally do. They flew a bunch of planes up and dropped a bunch of leaflets in Japan before all this was done, you know, warning people this is what was going to happen. You know. And that was just something you just wouldn't square very well for normal conditions, you know. So there were a lot of things that happened that just was a little different, but we had no idea of what the atomic bomb was or anything of that nature. You know, we just knew there was something very different and unusual going on.
So your opinion of dropping the bomb, once again?
Well, I think probably it's terrible to, in retrospect, to think of it, you know. And at the time, we thought probably it was the greatest thing that happened because it saved us from having to send a bunch of people in, and Lord only knows how many would have been killed in Japan if we'd invaded it. It's something you would never know, you know. So I think under the circumstances at the time, why, it was probably a good military decision, you know.
Looking back after 50 years, has this opinion changed at all?
No, I don't think you can second guess yourself. You know, if you could do that, you can change a lot of things that you would have never done. You know, I think it's terrible that that had to happen that way, and it had to be civilians. But I don't know that when they talk about civilians, I don't know that they're any different than people that are in the service. I don't know why there's any special designation made for them, you know. You hate to see that happen, but that's, I think when you fight wars, you fight to win. And I don't know that it's always the moral thing to do, but there's a lot of things that are done that perhaps that we wouldn't do under normal circumstances, you know, that's done during wartime. You know.
When were you officially discharged, and where did this take place at?
I was discharged at Jefferson Barracks, which is just outside of St. Louis, Missouri. And I was discharged let's have a look there. It was 4th of March, 1946.
Well, do you have any opinions or feelings about our nation's military status or its policies today as compared to when you served?
Well, of course, not being around the military that much anymore, well, you're talking about policy. Well, things are always in a state of constant change in the military because of it's so controlled by politics more than, I mean, the hierarchy is controlled by politics. So I presume as our political views change, our military views change, and it's much different, I know, than what it was when we were in. And I'm not so sure that that's all bad, you know, and I'm sure a lot of it is good. I think the way they treat people in the military is far better than what we were treated when we were in the military, because you were not given hardly any rights, which now they are. So I think there's been a lot of good strides made. Whether it helps or hinders the military, I don't know. But as a human being, it makes you feel better, you know.
Do you have any contact with the Veterans Administration?
No. I belong to American Legion, but I don't really have any contacts with them. Not not active in that area.
Would you like to tell us about how your family supported you during your military life? I know we talked earlier about mail and that kind of thing.
Well, you were gone, so I don't know how much support they could give you outside of what they would give you by writing you, and if you needed some particular thing, they would be able to get for you. I couldn't have asked for any better support than I had from my wife, especially, and my mother she would write me. She was very supportive. But my mother had 2 other boys in the service, and she was not. She was a hard-working farm woman, and she didn't have a lot of time to devote, but she always managed to write me too. And my sister, which was in high school age, she would usually write me once in a while too.
Well, over the years, what has this support meant to you when you kind of think back?
You know, it's very gratifying. You know, it's you need that very badly when you're away from home. You know, so anybody would. You know, it's a hard time in your life, especially when you're young and not used to being away from home. People in our generation probably. I had the furthest I had been away from home was Terre Haute when I went into the service. Well, at the time I got out of high school, not from the time I went into service because I lived in Detroit, but up till the time I got out of high school, Terre Haute, as far as I've been away from home, that's 28 miles from Martinsville.
You mentioned earlier that you lost a brother who was in the Army Air Corps.
Mm-hmm. That was a crew member on B-24.
When did you learn about that? When did that happen?
It happened in 1945, and I'll have to look at this.
So is that the telegram, the Western Union telegram?
This is one my wife got from my sister. See, they didn't they notify the immediate family. They don't notify them, and the American Red Cross does this. And then my sister, I was down in San Antonio at that particular time, which we were staging, getting ready to go overseas. This was in 1944, and this was a letter that a telegram I got from my sister. And it said that he was reported missing in action August the 10th over Albania. So August the 10th of 1944 was when he was listed as being missing in action. And then there was one in there that came from the commanding general that said he was missing. But that's only then later on they got after so long a time then they say he's officially dead whenever there's.
Was anybody returned to?
No. Most of the crew, they knew what happened to outside of him. It seemed like to me there were 4 of them that were interned, that got out of the plane, that were interned in German prison camps eventually. And then the pilot and the co-pilot, the tail gunner, who was, one of the guys said he was dead. The flak had hit the tail of the plane, and they went and checked him, and they said he knew he was dead. The pilot, the co-pilot, and the bombardier apparently went down with the aircraft. Some of the crew members got out. The navigator said that he went out the bomb bay right ahead of my brother, and he said he was going to go out right behind him. But then they said they never did see his shoot, so nobody seems to know. But eventually the Germans apparently produced his dog tags, so just had to assume from that he died. How he died or anything, we don't know. It was one of the crew that we didn't have any idea exactly what happened to. It's kind of strange, you know, that on all the rest of them. My sister had contact with with all the families that were saved, that got out and were imprisoned, but they didn't any of them seem to know for sure exactly what happened to him. So it's just one thing you don't know, but you just know that he died. That's all there is to it. Somewhere or other, either he went down with the aircraft, either that, or he got out and was shot or something before he could be taken prisoner. You never know what happens in this kind of situation.
Well, how did your experiences during World War II affect your life since that time?
Well, I don't know.
Well, do you feel your wartime contribution to the nation has been appreciated?
Oh yes, I do. I have no. I think it's just something that we all needed to do, and I don't think a person needs to be patted on the back all the time for something that you just should do. Yeah, I enjoyed. I didn't necessarily. It's not enjoyment of being there, but it was the enjoyment of being around people who have one common cause, and you're bonded by that, and you seem to be awful close. You're closer to people at that time probably than you are to anybody else in your life. It's just a camaraderie that you have with the people around you.
It seems that everyone I've talked to so far, it just seems like they say the same thing, and it's kind of hard to understand and to really describe. I think.
Well, you have a common bond because you're all, you're kind of, you think that you're pitted, it's you against the enemy and you against the hierarchy. You think that you're kind of out there by yourselves, isolated, and you've kind of got to be real close to each other because that's the only strength that you have, is be real close with each other, So it's a different kind of a comradeship than you ever have at any other time, because of that.
Especially when you look back and you're thinking, you're basically a young man or an older kid, whatever the age is.
We're kids, all of us. There were some an older guy was a guy that was 23, 4, or 5. If he was 26 or 7, why he was like Grandpa. And we used to we looked at those guys like they were the greatest philosophers in the world, because they had about 5 or 6 years on us, We would stand in awe of those people, especially, and very few people in those days were college educated, and some of those older guys were college educated. Man, we thought we were in hog heaven to be able to be around those particular type of people.
Well, when's the last time that you met with your the men you served with?
Well, let's see. We have another one that's seemed like it's been. This would be 1995. The next one coming up. The last one must have been in '93, because we have one coming up in this May in St. Petersburg, and it would have been 2 years between that and the last one. So a little bit less because we did it later on in the fall.
Now, do you meet always in the same place?
No, we've met in several different parts of the United States. We started in 1976, and that was the first one we had. We had been separated from the service 30 years before we had our first reunion.
What was that like, meeting those guys?
Oh, it was fabulous. There was a gentleman in Oklahoma City, and that was our staging area. And one of the guys in our outfit become very instrumental in trying to establish a reunion. So he started. I think his girlfriend had an 800 number, which he was using. So he started calling people that we had an old roster. All we had was a roster of people's home address when they were separated. And he had that address, so he started calling people in the outfit. So he managed to get a hold of about 15 people, and we formed a group to go and try to track down the most we could. We went to St. Louis, had a preparatory meeting and everything, and all of us got together, and we did a lot of work on trying to set up these reunions, which we started doing too. So, but he originally, his name was John Sewell. He originally did all the work on it. He had found several people before he got the rest of us involved. And he, of course, I'd left Martinsville, so he called Martinsville for me, and of course there was nobody with a phone number. So, but you always can get operators in small towns that a lot of times will help you. And he found out that I had moved to Marshall, so I wasn't in Martinsville. So then he called information over here and got my phone number and got hold of me. See, so it wasn't that difficult to find me. Some of them we never found. We only found a small portion, probably. There was about almost 100, I think almost 190 men in our unit, and I'd imagine we probably located 75 or 80, maybe 90, somewhere in that range. And of course, since then, a lot of those have passed on. So, but we still have about, maybe 20 to 25, 30 maybe will attend reunions even yet. We've got some that can't attend anymore. We've got some guys who are over 80 years old. The guys that were the older guys who were 29, 30 up in that range. They're over 80. So
have you learned anything by attending these reunions that you didn't know at the time that occurred during the war?
Not so much that. You learn different perspectives on what you think happened and what somebody else thinks happened, of certain things, surrounding it. You have after 40, 50 years, you have a perception of exactly what you think happened, and you listen to somebody else and they have a different perception of the same event that happened, and you wonder who's right and who isn't right, you know. So somewhere in between has to be the answer to it, that maybe you perceive it to be a little bit different than somebody else does, or they perceive it to be different than what you think it was, Not great big glaring things, but little things, that you can't quite conceive of being the same,
You mentioned that you were a watchmaker.
Mm-hmm.
Tell me what you did after you got out of the military and you returned to civilian life. What career did you follow? What career path?
Well, the friend that I had established a friendship with a gentleman in St. Louis while I was in the service. His name was Howard Marks, which was in my outfit. And he was instrumental in getting me trained as a watchmaker. So after he was separated, he had been in the service a year longer than I, and he had served one term overseas in the Aleutian Islands when we had troops up there during the early part of the war, and he had served the stand up there. So when it came time to be separated from the service after the war was over, he had a lot more points than I did, so he went home first. And he was home and was working for a jewelry firm in St. Louis when I was separated from Jefferson Parish. So I called him when I arrived in Jefferson Parish and told him I was in. So we'd established a real close friendship when we were overseas. So he and his wife came down to the base and picked me up, and so we'd go out and party a couple of nights. So we were there, And so one of the first things he told me, he said, "Herb, I've got a job for you." And I said, I uttered a word I wouldn't want to use now. And I said, "Howard, I'm not even out of the service yet. You've got me a job." And he said, "Well, that's all right." He says, "You don't have to take it." He said, "But I'd like for you to go down and talk to my boss after you get out." So the day that I got out of the service, I went down and interviewed for the job.
In St. Louis.
In St. Louis. So the guy basically hired me, wanted to go to work for him. He had 4 stores in St. Louis, and he only had Howard was the only watchmaker he had working for him. So I decided I was going to go work for him. So Violet came down the day I was separated. We partied in St. Louis the day before we went back home. We went back home. It was the latter part of the week, and it might have been Thursday or Friday. And then that Monday, I went back to St. Louis to go to work as a watchmaker for this firm, which was called Schneider's, in South St. Louis. So I worked for them as a watchmaker for about 6 months. And I was commuting back and forth on the weekends coming home because Violet was still here and she was still teaching in Martinsville. So I would commute back home. I'd leave down there on Saturday night after we closed the store, which was about 9 o'clock. Then I'd get on a bus somewhere, we'd get home about 3 or 4 in the morning. And then I'd be home on Sunday. Then I'd have to go home, leave real early Monday morning, about 2 or 3 in the morning, and go back to St. Louis, so I'd be at work the next morning. So this went on for about 6 months. And one day, Violet was in Terre Haute, and a man by the name of Harold Luce, which is before your time, where you didn't remember him. He was a watchmaker from Marshall who worked in Terre Haute most of his life, and he had a little individual bench and shop inside of one of the drugstores over there. In other words, watchmakers would just crop up everywhere, some of them in those days. But anyhow, he had his own little place over there, and he knew everybody, and he said, by the way, he said, what's your husband doing? She said, well, he didn't know what I was watchmaker. She said, what's your husband doing? She told him. I said, well, where's he working? She said, St. Louis. And he said, well, what's he working down there for? She said, there's plenty of jobs around here. And he said, back to Hillman's been wanting watchmakers real bad. And my wife said, well, he just got hired down there and he's still going back and forth. So when I came home that week, she told me that he had mentioned that he wanted me to go over and check with Mr. Felstein, because he knew he was wanting to watch me. So I did, and he wanted me to come work for him. So I quit my job down there, since I couldn't find a place to live down there either. In 1946, you just couldn't find housing. There wasn't any place to go. So I quit and then came to Terre Haute. I started to work for him. Well, I actually started to work for his son, Alan, who at that time had a store that was called Big Woods. It was over on North 6th Street. And it was an old line jewelry store which had a lot of fine old fixtures and only sold fine silver and fine diamonds and watches. So I went over there as a watchmaker. And Alan owned the store. It was Mr. Felstein's son, So I worked there from 1946 as a watchmaker till 1962, when they decided the store wasn't as profitable as they would like. They decided to close it. So after that, then I went to work at Hillman's as a watchmaker for, well, about 5 years or so, I think, and then I started working as a full-time salesman, and that was the last of my watchmaking career. I quit watchmaking and everything. So I was in the jewelry business about 43 years, and I spent about 20 or so of it as a watchmaker and a little over 20 as a salesman. So I had about a half and half career.
Is watchmakers, are they still employed at a number of jewelers? Is it still a trade that...
It's a viable trade, but there's just hardly any of them around, and it's a completely different type of job now than it used to be, because all the watches were mechanical before, and now most of the watch is electronic, very little mechanical part to it anymore. They're all quartz model watches, and it's more of a replacement component part type of thing that where used to be more repaired watches, So there's hardly any of them around anymore. It's almost a dying breed, But know that we used to have one time, I think when I was at Hillman's, I may have had 5 or 6 watchmakers working for me. And now, if they've got one, they're probably lucky.
Huh.
So that's kind of the way things go.
Well, Herb, I need to say thank you for the time in which you've given to me for cooperating with this project. I appreciate you sitting down and sharing
pleasure.
your experiences with me, and I just want to thank you.
That's my pleasure. I hope you derive something that you can use out of it.
You
I don't
really
know what it
have.
would be, but if you can.
Everyone's experience is different, and all of the experiences added to the outcome. You know, everyone had a job to do, and they did it.
Oh yes, sure.
Yeah.
There were about 11 million of us involved, and you know that everybody wasn't going to be involved in fighting. The biggest job of